They say silence is golden, but sometimes silence is a weapon, and the man who uses it to bury another man's truth will one day find that same silence returning, not as a shield, but as a verdict. This is a story about betrayal, about the slow and patient machinery of karma, and about one thing that no powerful man has ever successfully destroyed: the truth. Welcome to Honor Tales. The town of Millhaven, Georgia, had exactly the kind of beauty that concealed ugliness well. It sat at the edge of a wide river, surrounded by old oak trees draped in Spanish moss, with a main street of brick storefronts that looked like something painted by a man who believed the world was simpler than it actually was. The people of Millhaven were proud of their town, the way people are proud of things they haven't truly examined, because examination, in a place like Millhaven, had historically come at a price that most residents preferred not to pay. Gerald Okafor had lived in Millhaven his entire 38 years. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having learned early and painfully that the wrong words said to the wrong people in the wrong town produced consequences that echoed for decades. He ran a small auto repair shop on the south end of Main Street, Gerald's Automotive, a hand-painted sign above the garage door, 2 hydraulic lifts, a coffee machine that was always on, and a reputation built over 15 years of honest work that meant something in a town where reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. He was not wealthy. He was not powerful. But he was trusted. That trust was what made him dangerous to Raymond Albright. Raymond Albright was Millhaven's most successful man by every metric the town used to measure success. The largest house on Caldwell Hill, a construction company that had built half the commercial properties in the county, a seat on the town council, and a smile that he deployed with the precision of a man who understood exactly what smiles were for. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that belongs to men who have never genuinely faced consequences for anything they have done. His wife, Patricia, organized the church fundraisers. His son, Bradley, had a football scholarship to a state university. Everything about Raymond Albright's life said, "This is a man who has done everything right." Everything about it was a construction. Gerald Okafor knew this, because Gerald Okafor had, entirely by accident, seen something he was never supposed to see. It happened on a Tuesday evening in March, when Gerald stayed late at the shop to finish an engine rebuild for a customer who needed the vehicle by morning. The shop sat adjacent to a small access road behind the row of Main Street businesses, a road that most people in Millhaven didn't think about or use. Gerald was under the hood of a Ford pickup at 9:47 p.m. when he heard voices through the open side door of the garage. 2 men, speaking in the urgent, compressed way that people speak when they believe they are not being observed. He recognized Raymond Albright's voice immediately. The second voice took him a moment longer. It belonged to Victor Crane, Raymond's chief contractor, and the man who actually managed the day-to-day operations of Albright Construction. What Gerald heard in the next 4 minutes was not something he could unhear. 3. Raymond and Victor were discussing a construction project, specifically the new community center that Albright Construction had won the contract to build the previous year. A project funded largely by municipal bonds and federal grant money. Gerald understood enough about business to follow the conversation. Materials had been substituted, cheaper alternatives used where the contract specified higher-grade specifications, and the difference in cost, which Gerald's mind, trained by years of calculating parts costs and labor, computed to be somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000, had been divided between the 2 men through a series of shell accounts that Victor was describing in the practiced shorthand of someone who had done this before. What Gerald understood most clearly was this: the community center that the people of Millhaven believed was being built to the highest standard was structurally compromised, and Raymond Albright intended for no one to ever know. Gerald did not move. He barely breathed. He stayed exactly where he was, half under the hood of the Ford pickup, until the voices receded and the access road fell silent. Then he straightened up, wiped his hands on his shop rag, and stood alone in his garage for a long time, thinking about what kind of man he was. He went to the county building inspector the following Monday. He told them exactly what he had heard. He was specific about the date, the time, the language used, the names. He submitted a written statement. He was told the matter would be investigated. 6 days later, Raymond Albright came to Gerald's shop. He came alone, which meant he had thought carefully about what he was going to say. He sat down in the plastic chair across from Gerald's desk, the chair that customers sat in when they were waiting for their vehicles, and he crossed his legs and rested his hands on his knee in the manner of a man who has decided to be generous. He spoke for about 8 minutes. What he said, organized simply, was this. Gerald had misheard a private business conversation. The inspection reports on the community center were clean. The county inspector, a man named Doug Haverfield, whom Raymond referred to by first name with the ease of long acquaintance, had found no irregularities. Gerald's complaint had been reviewed and closed, and if Gerald were to continue making allegations that he could not prove, he would find that Millhaven was a town with a long memory for men who caused trouble without cause. Gerald looked at Raymond Albright for a long moment after he finished speaking. "I know what I heard," Gerald said. Raymond uncrossed his legs and stood up. "I know you think you do," he replied. And then he smiled, that precise, practiced smile, and walked out of the shop. What happened next happened slowly, the way the worst things always do. First, Gerald lost 3 of his longest-standing commercial accounts, small businesses whose owners explained, awkwardly and without meeting his eyes, that they were going in a different direction. Then someone filed a complaint with the state licensing board, alleging that Gerald's shop had performed fraudulent repairs on a vehicle, a complaint that was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence, but not before Gerald spent 4 months and most of his savings on legal fees responding to it. Then the lease on his shop building came up for renewal, and the property owner, a man who had renewed it without issue for 9 consecutive years, declined to renew, offering no explanation beyond a brief letter delivered by a real estate attorney. Within 14 months of that Monday morning at the county building inspector's office, Gerald Okafor's shop was closed. His savings were gone. His reputation, in the particular social architecture of Millhaven, was a structure with cracks running through every wall. He moved into a 2-room apartment on the north side of town and took a job as a mechanic at a regional truck depot 40 minutes away, a job that paid him enough to live and not enough to rebuild. He was not a man given to bitterness, not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because he understood, with a clarity that came from the particular kind of suffering that strips away pretense, that bitterness was a fire that burned the house it was lit in. He did his work. He kept to himself. He paid his rent, but he did not stop knowing what he knew. The community center opened 18 months after Gerald's shop closed. There was a ribbon-cutting ceremony on a Saturday morning in June. Raymond Albright stood at the center of the photographs in the local paper, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, one hand on the giant scissors and the other on the mayor's shoulder, his smile occupying exactly as much of his face as he intended it to. The building stood for 4 years. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, a day that began with no particular sign of its own importance, a section of the community center's second-floor mezzanine collapsed during a youth basketball program. 14 people were on the mezzanine when it gave way. The collapse lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds is enough time for a great many things to become permanent. 11 people were injured, 2 of them seriously. One of them, a 9-year-old girl named Abigail Trent, who had been waiting for her brother's practice to end, spent 6 weeks in the hospital with injuries that her doctors described, with careful medical language, as life-altering. No one died. This was the closest thing to mercy that the day offered. What came after the collapse came fast, because structural failures at public buildings funded by federal money produce a category of attention that is different in quality from ordinary local scrutiny. Federal investigators, state engineers, independent structural analysts hired by the families of the injured, whose attorneys were the kind who understood that the distance between a civil case and a criminal referral was often measured in documents. The documents, in this case, were the material substitution records that Victor Crane had kept. Victor Crane had kept them because Victor Crane was, underneath his role in the scheme, a careful and frightened man who had understood from the beginning that his position in the arrangement was not the same as Raymond's. Raymond had the connections, the reputation, the relationships with inspectors and council members. Victor had the operational knowledge, and Victor had long since privately concluded that if the arrangement ever came apart, Raymond would ensure that Victor bore the weight of it alone. So Victor had kept records. Not openly, not in any place that Raymond would have thought to look, but carefully, completely, in a manner that reflected 14 years of quietly preparing for a day he hoped would never come. When the federal investigators came, Victor Crane cooperated completely. The trial lasted 9 weeks. It was held in federal court in Atlanta, which meant that Raymond Albright's relationships with Doug Haverfield and the Mill Haven Town Council were not assets he could deploy. The evidence, material records, financial transfers, shell account documentation, and Victor Crane's detailed testimony, was the kind of evidence that a good defense attorney can slow down but cannot stop. Gerald Okafor was called as a witness. He sat in the federal courtroom on a Thursday morning, in a suit he had bought for the occasion, and he told a federal jury exactly what he had heard on a Tuesday evening in March, 4 years and 8 months earlier, through the open side door of a garage on the access road behind Main Street. He was specific about the date, about the time, about the language used, about the names. He had been specific before, of course, in a county building inspector's office, to a man named Doug Haverfield, who had found Raymond Albright's phone number in his contacts more recently than he should have. That specificity had cost Gerald everything he had built over 15 years. This time, the specificity cost Raymond Albright everything he had built over 30. Raymond was convicted on 7 federal counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and criminal negligence resulting in injury. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Victor Crane received a reduced sentence of 4 years in exchange for his cooperation. Doug Haverfield, the county building inspector, was separately charged and convicted on 2 counts of accepting bribes and falsifying public records. The morning after the verdict, Gerald Okafor drove to Mill Haven. He parked on Main Street and sat in his car for a while, looking at the brick storefronts, the old oak trees, the Spanish moss. It was early, and the street was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet before they remember themselves. He wasn't sure exactly why he had come. He had not lived here in nearly 5 years. The apartment he rented 40 minutes away was as much home as anything now. He thought about the 9-year-old girl named Abigail Trent, and what life-altering meant, and would mean, in the decades ahead of her. He thought about the 14 months of slow destruction that had followed his Monday morning visit to the county inspector's office. The accounts, the complaint, the lease, the savings. He thought about the plastic chair in his old shop, where Raymond Albright had sat with his legs crossed and his hands on his knee, and explained, in the careful language of a man accustomed to arranging reality, that Gerald had misheard something. He thought about what he had known, the entire time, that Raymond had not. The truth does not require your protection. It does not need you to fight for it, or defend it, or carry it safely through years of difficulty. It is not fragile in the way that power is fragile, or reputation, or the careful arrangements that men like Raymond spend lifetimes constructing. The truth simply waits. It keeps its own record. It moves at its own pace, in its own time, by its own mechanism. A federal investigation, a frightened contractor's files, a courtroom in Atlanta. And it arrives, eventually, with a completeness that no amount of influence or silence or carefully deployed smiles can interrupt. Gerald had known this. On the Tuesday evening when he heard two men dividing money that did not belong to them, he had known what was true. 4 years and 8 months of difficulty had not changed what was true. And what was true had, in its own time and by its own means, become the verdict. He got out of the car. He walked down Main Street in the early morning quiet. He stopped in front of the building where his shop had been. There was a clothing boutique there now, a tasteful sign in the window, racks of jackets visible through the glass. He stood there for a moment. Then he nodded, to the building, or to the street, or to some private understanding that required no audience, and walked back to his car. He had a shift at the depot in 3 hours. He drove toward it in the morning light, through the oak trees and the moss and the wide river, out of the town that had tried to decide what the truth was worth, and back toward a life that had never needed Millhaven's permission to continue. Karma, people often misunderstand, is not punishment. It is not revenge. It is not a force that arrives in anger or with any particular interest in making anyone suffer. It is simply the record, the unalterable, patient, complete record of what was done and what was known and what was true. A record that exists independently of who believes it, who suppresses it, who has the connections to ensure that a county inspector files the right paperwork. Raymond Albright did not lose because Gerald Okafor was brave enough to tell the truth. He lost because the truth was always there. Gerald had simply refused to pretend otherwise. That, in the end, is the only power that any ordinary person truly needs. Not connections, not money, not a house on Caldwell Hill, just the refusal to pretend.